and I would like to introduce our presenter this evening, Mark Hayman, who is an OUBS MBA alumni. Mark is a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt improvement leader. He works with organisations to improve their business performance. In his spare time, Mark also works with the Prince's Trust as a mentor. I will now hand you over to Mark, who will tell you a bit more about his background and Six Sigma. It's over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Janet, and hello everyone. Welcome to the career webinar, which I hope you will all find enjoyable, insightful, and good use of your time. There's a lot of talk about Lean Six Sigma in organisations and questions about how it can benefit an organisation. And what I'm going to be going through with you in the presentation is how a Lean Six Sigma based improvement activity can lead to all sorts of beneficial outcomes for not only the organisation and your clients and customers, but also employees as well. So typical outcomes for Lean Six Sigma based improvement activity would be improvements to customer satisfaction, cost reduction, many cases a reduction in risk profile, capacity creation, process efficiency, and as a consequence, in part of all of that, very often one sees an improvement in employee morale as well. I mentioned capacity creation. Sometimes the context for improvement projects based on Lean Six Sigma methodology is to create capacity for headcount reduction, but the context can also be very positive ones. So some of my recent clients, for example, have been entrepreneurships moving to the next stage of their evolution and wanting to scale up. So the context for those projects has been very much creating capacity to grow, to enable them to take on the work of new clients and so on. So that's a little bit about how Lean Six Sigma based projects can help you and the organisation and your teams. As Janet mentioned, we've got two parts to the session. The first will be introducing you to Lean Six Sigma, what it is, and some of the key principles to it. I'll introduce you to some more concepts after that, and end the first section with some reference to the industries and sectors using Lean Six Sigma based continuous improvement activity. As Janet mentioned, there will be some questions there, so an opportunity for you to ask any questions on part one, and then to give you a heads up in terms of what is to come in part two. Going to be introducing you to some of the tools that are used. Lean Six Sigma comes with a big toolbox full of tools to deploy as required and as the situation it requires it. So I'm going to be introducing you to some of those. I'm also going to be talking about how a Lean Six Sigma based project would be structured. And I'm also going to talk very briefly about certification. So some of you may have heard terminology around yellow belts, green belts and black belts. Indeed, Janet mentioned that in the introduction. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that and highlighting how that may benefit you as well. And then, as Janet said, we'll end with some final questions. Okay, so for part one then, let's introduce you to some keys to Lean Six Sigma. What is Lean Six Sigma about? So the first idea is around clients and customers. Lean Six Sigma based improvement activity is about improving a client or customer experience. Most often that relates to the quality with which products or services are being delivered to your customers and speed, so the time it takes from the order through to receipt of the product or service. Customers in the context of Lean Six Sigma is a fairly broad definition, so this does not exclusively relate to your external customer, the one that is purchasing your end product or service. It's very helpful for Lean Six Sigma projects to take a broader definition of customer and consider also internal customers, so stakeholders, teams, for example, that one team hands off to another. It's helpful to look at those handoffs as a product or service that you deliver to a customer, albeit an internal one. So big focus on delighting customers with Lean Six Sigma. Another key element relates to improving processes. So, as I'll explain shortly, this relates to reducing variation and reducing defects. A defect in this context is anything that doesn't add value to the customer, something that they wouldn't see a value in. And also improving the process flow, and again I'll talk about what process flow is and ways that that can be improved upon. So we have delighting customers and improving processes, and all of this is achieved through teamwork and collaboration. Lean Six Sigma projects provide an opportunity for employees to get involved. They require it in order for them to be successful. So these aren't projects that are commissioned by third parties and are done to an organisation. Rather, it's a partnership. Often an injection of subject matter expertise is required if that doesn't exist within the organisation already. But it's very much the organisation's project, it's their people, and the whole thing is done very collaboratively. So for people involved in Lean Six Sigma based improvement activity, there are great opportunities to further develop their problem-solving capability, their decision-making capability, and obviously continuous improvement, process improvement skills as well. All of these are underpinned by a real need to focus on data and facts. So prioritization of activity for improvement and measurement of the effectiveness of the changes introduced as a result of the Lean Six Sigma activity require data and facts. This can be quite challenging in many organizations. Some leaders find themselves in situations of managing their part of the business with really very limited data and MI. So it really is very, very difficult. But Lean Six Sigma requires that. So often what is needed as a Lean Six Sigma project is started, where data doesn't exist, is to go out and get it, which can be little time consuming. It's not the most exciting of activities either for the organisation, but very, very necessary in order to establish a baseline for improvement and, as I say, to determine where the priorities are. So rather than relying on intuition and gut feel around, for example, areas of client dissatisfaction, there's a definite need to capture data to prove it. So those are the key elements of Lean Six Sigma, which I'll be unpacking a little bit more for you. I'm going to start with the first element around delighting customers. So I mentioned speed and quality. Cost, of course, is the other variable that it's important to consider. And it might be your view that these are mutually exclusive. In fact, they're not. Lean Six Sigma regards these as inextricably linked. So, for example, if I give you an example, a process that makes a lot of errors can't keep up its speed. So if a process should take 2 days end to end, taking account of various handoffs, and there are errors, then the amount of time that is required to then rework that process as a consequence of the errors will have the effect of elongating the time it takes to execute the process. So speed and or rather high quality makes it possible to attain a fast speed. Similarly, if we think about a process that works slowly, is prone to errors. Now that might be contrary to popular opinion. One would think that the slower something is, the more likely it is that it will be executed accurately and right first time. There is a real risk the longer the process takes. Now obviously, depending on the organisation that you're in and the sector and the industry that you're in, some processes take a long time. So if we think about legal work, for example, conveyancing, anything like that, there is a set amount of process steps to take, and there is a set period of time that takes to do. However, generally speaking, the slower something is, the more prone it is to errors, because it's kind of sitting in work queues, either in people's inboxes or in a manufacturing context. It's kind of work in progress that has to be stored, and there is a cost to storing it and so on. And the longer something is in transit, in other words, in a state that isn't yet ready to deliver to the client, the more likely it is that will incur some cost to the organisation and raise the possibility of errors as well. So the aim of Lean Six Sigma is to move all of those in the right direction rather than to cherry pick and focus on one at the exclusion of the others. Turning to improving processes, very simplified view of a process here. Think of any process that you follow in your own organisations. What do we mean by improving the process flow and the speed? So we've got a couple of decision boxes here. The diamond-shaped boxes represent a decision required in this process. And then depending on the answer there to that decision, yes or no, the process deviates into two or three different areas. Now what might be indicated is that there are problems with a couple of the areas. These might be areas that you've had some client complaints about, or indeed employees might be saying to you that this feels really clunky, it's wasting time and so on. So the focus in a Lean Six Sigma project would be to target those areas, target those particular process steps, with a view to reducing the overall number and therefore improving the flow. By flow we mean how something gets from the left-hand side of that diagram to the right-hand side, depending on whichever path it takes. So it's making that a really straightforward process that enables that thing, whatever it is that's going through the process, a service or a product, to get from A to B in the shortest possible time. What I've just described in terms of reducing the waste, so that's a new term for you, which we'll be looking at in a little bit more detail in a slide or two's time. Waste is really anything that doesn't add value from the client's perspective. And the principles around waste reduction are the bits that relate to Lean. So we're talking about Lean Six Sigma. The Lean element of Lean Six Sigma relates to improving the process flow and speed through the reduction of waste. So let's look at the Six Sigma element, and this concerns itself with variation. The graph here represents a normal distribution, which you'll be familiar with, and to that I've added on the dotted vertical lines either side of the center one the lowest acceptable and highest acceptable values from the customer's point of view. So we could interpret this as perhaps the time it takes for something to be delivered to the client, or it could be how long it takes for a call to be answered, for example, in a call center. Now, when you actually get the data to show you what's happening on that process, it would normally be distributed like this one here. So everything to the left of the lowest acceptable value and everything to the right of the highest acceptable value, in the eyes of the customer, is a defect. So the idea behind the Six Sigma element to Lean Six Sigma focuses on reducing the variability, so that after a Lean Six Sigma project, you obtain the same data and you would still have a normal distribution, but the amount of defects, in other words, outside of the tolerance specified by your customer, is better. So you have less defect. And that's the Six Sigma element. Just a word on the Six Sigma and where the Sigma term fits in. Sigma is a Greek term, as you know, and it really relates to the variability. So process yields are the percentage of goods or services that are good enough to be sold to customers. So thinking back to the earlier diagram, something that is within their tolerance. And so the term Six Sigma relates to the extent to which there is variability in that process. So as you can see from the table on this slide, when you get up to a process that is performing at 6 sigma, there is really very, very little variability. You've got that variability down to a really, really, really low number. So in terms of organizations starting out with Lean Six Sigma based projects, the realistic goal would not be for those organizations to be getting to Six Sigma. In reality, particularly in organizations where the data is more limited, it would be a more realistic objective to say that you'd get to 2 sigma in the first few stages of your continuous improvement effort. So that's a little bit about the breakdown of Lean Six Sigma. So to recap, Lean is concerned with the reduction of waste. Waste is anything that doesn't add value from a client perspective, and Six Sigma relates to the reduction in variability. In terms of the working together, I've mentioned that the team working element to the projects enable those involved to strengthen their collaborative skills, problem solving and decision making skills. The slide here represents the team norms, if you like, the ways of working that a project involved in a Lean Six Sigma activity would commit to and hold each other to account to. So around collaboration, there would be goal setting, clear accountability, effective conflict management and resolution, effective meetings, and so on. So there's a real focus on strengthening the way that people work together through a Lean Six Sigma transformation. In terms of decisions and facts, I've already mentioned that there often is a lack of available data. Sometimes in organizations, because of the fact that there isn't a great deal of data, there can be little training in collecting or analyzing it. So when it does start becoming available, it does create a need to make sure that you're supporting people in the organization with the new data that's made available to them. And sometimes one finds that data is used in a negative context as well, rather than more positively. And in terms of good outcomes for a Lean Six Sigma project, typically they would involve the creation of measures on the elements here. So customer satisfaction, definitely some measurement around financial outcomes, speed and lead time. We'll be talking about lead time in a little bit, and also some measure of quality and defects, something that isn't pleasing your client. A few more concepts, and then we'll move to some questions on this first part. So Lean Six Sigma is very interested in work in progress. I've mentioned that the longer a process takes, the greater the opportunity for creating efficiencies typically, because whilst it's sitting in inboxes or on a factory floor as work in progress, that's costing the organisation to hold it as a piece of work in progress. The definition is simply something that's officially part of the process but not yet complete, something that you can't yet deliver to your client because it's not ready. I've mentioned lead time. This is simply the time it takes to deliver a service or product once the order's been triggered, whatever is the right context in your organisation. So from when you become aware of a client need to delivering it against that need is the overall lead time. So in the diagram here, it's the length of time it takes to get from the first yellow box to the second yellow box. I mentioned waste. Here it is in the diagram on the right-hand side. The goal with Lean Six Sigma-based projects is to eliminate that. So anything that doesn't add value to your client is classified as waste. There is another classification. So it's non-value add from your client perspective, but it might be value add from the business's perspective. So the name given to these activities is business value add, and examples of that might be compliance with statutory or regulatory requirements, quality checks, that kind of thing, something that is in place for good reason, but a business benefit rather than something that adds value to the client. So typically what happens is when a process is deconstructed during a Lean Six Sigma activity, great effort is put into classifying every element of that process. So is it something that is value add from your client's perspective? Is it business value add? Is it waste? And in that way it's possible to pinpoint specifically which elements of that process should be prioritized for improvement. In terms of a simple measure, I mentioned when I was talking about measurement, a simple measure of process efficiency is the value add time, the time that your customers recognize as value add for them, and divide that by your total lead time. So if we go back to this diagram here, it might be that whole end-to-end lead time is 2 days, but the value add element to that takes 10 minutes. So 10 divided by 2 days, 10 minutes divided by 2 days gives you a rough figure to start working on in terms of process efficiency. And obviously that can give you a baseline for your improvement activity as well. Finally then, in this first section, here are some of the industries using Lean Six Sigma. Some of these may surprise you, maybe not. I guess the message here is that it's completely transferable. Whilst concepts like work in progress and some of the other things I've mentioned may resonate less in some industries, simply we don't use the tools that would require us to look at that. So Lean Six Sigma is not a case of using every single tool in the box. You look at the business context, identify what goals the business is trying to achieve, and then use tools appropriately. And this is why one finds it does transfer across multiple industries. Lean Six Sigma really began in manufacturing, in car production, in Toyota, and was copied, and then what happened was it's migrated into other industries, banking, financial services, retail, because these organizations recognized that this was something transferable and it could work in their environments. So we've come to the end of
Mark,
part
yes,
one.
while we're waiting for some of the questions to come in, I have actually got a question myself. You mentioned several sectors in your last slide. What I did notice is you haven't got the higher education sector. I wonder, do you think that, say, an organisation like the Open University would benefit from Six Sigma?
Yes, you're right, it's omitted, not included, and I would say that they would, most definitely. I think any organisation where there are customers, where there are processes, has an opportunity to make improvements through the adoption of Lean Six Sigma tools and techniques.
He's saying that he's introduced Lean into his IT operations department via removal of waste. As I'm effectively self-learning, is it worth investigating the Six Sigma element via self-training? Some of the courses seem expensive for self-funding. I think that's a very good question.
Yeah, it is. So, Robert, well done for starting off. It sounds like you've started off by looking on the lean side of things with waste removal. I think it very much depends on sort of the outcomes that you're looking to achieve. So, if you're if you have objectives around improving your lead time, for example, even more, I know you'll have done some work already through the removal of the waste, but perhaps where variability is indicated with your data, or even if you've got a gut feel that there is some variability going on, then the likelihood is that some Six Sigma work could release some more benefit for you. But I do get the point around some of the training. There are some excellent books, actually. I'm going to be talking about certification in part 2. That is an option, but if you're self-funding, that is expensive, as Robert said. So there are a couple of pretty good books available, which assume no prior knowledge and can help Robert, you and others that want to start exploring how this might help. Once you've started kind of using the book and the techniques, it might be that your organisation is more open to
Thank you, Mark. We've also had one from Laura. Can Lean be used in education management?
Thank you, Mark. We've also had one from Laura. Can Lean be used in education management?
Yes, it can. A colleague of mine actually is working in the education sector at the moment. It's all about application of the tools, and as always, it begins with a clear understanding of what are you trying to achieve? So are you trying to make it a quicker process? Are you trying to create better outcomes for customers? Are you trying to improve reputation, reduce risk, whatever it is, or cost. And I think provided you start out with clear objectives, or certainly clarity around kind of outcomes, you might not have it as an objective clearly defined, but certainly a trajectory, a desired outcome, then you will find a Lean Six Sigma tool.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I have had a question from Rick about, are there any MBA courses that offer Lean Six Sigma as part of the course? To be honest with you, I'm not sure, Rick. I will explore that and get back to you when I send out the email at the end. Okay, I think if you'd like to carry on, Mark, and then we'll take some more questions at the end.
Sure. Okay, so part 2, it's going to talk a little bit about how projects are structured, and I'm going to give you some examples of the tools. Then I'm going to be talking about certifications. I've seen a question here around books as well, so in that section I'll cover off and give you the titles of a couple of books. And then I'm going to also place Lean Six Sigma into a broader context for you, because often this improvement activity is not restricted to the elements that I'm talking about, and it's actually undertaken as part of a broader program of change. So starting with how Lean Six Sigma projects are actually structured, there are 5 phases altogether. It begins with the define stage. So this is really reaching agreement with a sponsor and other people around the scope, the goals, the outcomes that we've just been talking about, and really what the purpose is of this project, what do people want it to achieve. The next stage is measure. So this is around data collection. I've mentioned that can be challenging in some organizations. So it's coming up with a plan to capture data where it doesn't exist, or to manipulate the data into a usable format if it does exist. The purpose of which is to thoroughly understand the current state. So you're not basing Lean Six Sigma activity on hypothesis. It begins with a hypothesis which you later try to prove or disprove with data, but you're not relying exclusively on a gut feel. There has to be data to back it up. After the data is made available or that it's obtained, the next stage is around analysing it. And this is where you're looking at the causes of the problem or problems that you're trying to solve. Lots of techniques, which I'll give you some examples of how you would go about analysing the situation, some statistical tools, as well as some kind of brainstorming activity and working with the people closest to the process. That's why the teamwork element in the middle of those pillars that I showed you in one of the early slides, that is so imperative. It's vital that people involved in this process are connected to the project. They don't need to be leading it and involved full time necessarily, but certainly participating, making suggestions, and being part of that continuous improvement effort is really essential. The next stage after the analysis is to actually set about making the improvements. Sometimes this would involve a pilot if you're feeling confident, and in certain contexts it might not be applicable to do a pilot, but you're making the improvements and then seeing what results are being achieved as a result of the activity that you've taken. And then after the improvement activity has been implemented, there is a control phase, which is about making sure that the situation is sustained. So this isn't all about achieving quick wins and then the process falling back to how it was before you made your changes. It's about creating something that is sustainable. So the control phase is about making sure that that has embedded within the organization, creating tools and measures, metrics to actually support that sustainability, and on a practical level just handing over things to business as usual owners and so on. So those are the stages of a project. If anyone on the call has or has experience of prints, you'll know that the key with any kind of methodology or framework like this is in its flexibility. It's actually flexing these stages to fit the context of what you're doing. So in other words, if you're choosing a fairly straightforward project for your first one, maybe with a limited scope, a small process maybe affecting not very many people, just to try, find your feet, then you would navigate your way through these stages probably quicker than would be the case if we were talking about a Lean Six Sigma project as part of a big transformational change project taking 18 months. So as always, it's about taking these tools and this framework and flexing it to the environment that you're in. Now, I've promised to give you some examples of some of the tools. So I'm going to go through stage by stage, just a couple of examples, one or two examples for each of the phases. So in define, this is where, you remember, this is where we identify and agree with sponsors what the objectives of the project would be. Now sometimes what can be helpful in that definition is to produce a Sidewalk diagram. So this is a very, very useful tool to do quite early on in a project, kind of day one, day two. It's forming an initial view as to what this process actually looks like. What happens in the construction of a Sidewalk diagram is that you, so Sidewalk is so called because of the headings here in the yellow boxes, so suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. And how I would construct this is that I'd be asking the group I was working with, right, so tell me about the first step of the process. What do you do first? And then I would fill in that process column and fill in what they've told me under process step 1. And then I'd say, right, what's the input to that process? Is there something that you need from somebody to trigger that process? So it might be that you need the input of a customer request, for example, or a customer call. And then I would say, right, who's the supplier of that? And then I jump to the right-hand side and I say, right, what do you produce as an output for that process step? So do you hand it off to somebody? Do you complete a pro forma? What do you do next? And then who do you produce that output for? Who is the customer that you're producing that output for? And then go down the column again, so go back to the process step and say, right, so what's your second process step? Again, what's the input, who supplies it, what's the output, and who for? And so that can be constructed fairly quickly. Have gone into some organisations and sort of say, right, what's step one of the process? And they'll say, we haven't got a process. So that can be quite taxing, but the tool itself is a good way of kind of teasing the information out, because obviously, even though people might not think they have a process, they're doing something. So it's a case of working out what it is they're doing. So that's a Sidewalk diagram. Next one looks much more complicated, which is why I didn't show it to you first of all. This is a value stream map. Now this is getting into much more granular detail. This is working out, remember the slide I showed you on customer value add, business value add, waste. This is where we would be identifying things that are falling into each of those categories. We would be using data to tell us how long each of these process steps take. So the boxes in the middle of this diagram are the process steps, and we're capturing all sorts of very valuable information like how many FTE, full-time equivalent people, are working on that particular process step, how many are you doing, and then how long does it take? And of the time it takes, how much of that time is client value add? So we're getting into quite a granular level of detail here as a means of working out what's going on and where the opportunities are. The bit at the bottom of this diagram where you've got 30 minutes, 2 hours and so on, that denotes the wait time, how long these things are taking to do. So like I mentioned, you might have got a lead time of 48 hours, of which your processing time, the actual time that people are spending doing something, keying something into a computer or serving the client, that might be a very much lower figure. So a value stream map can help us quantify and visualize what all of that is looking like. And that can be quite good, a good tool to use with sponsors as well, because sometimes if you're trying to make a case for something and you're relying on anecdote and kind of gut feel, that can be less effective in certain situations than doing something like this and actually going to a sponsor with some data that says, look, we've got a real problem here, or there's an opportunity here to make this very much better for customers. Going to move us on to the next stage in the process, which is measure. So a couple of tools here, ones that you may be familiar with already, in fact. So the first of them is Pareto. Pareto is a fairly simple tool. It just enables us to identify the vital few from the trivial many. It was a Mr. Pareto, I believe he was an Italian gentleman, who identified that sort of 80% of a problem, 80% of a problem can be attributed to 20% of the causes. So you can focus on a fewer number of causes. In this case, let's say A and B would get you to 80% of what's going wrong. So it's better to spend your time on improving A and B in this diagram than it is on doing all 6. So that's a prioritization tool, and once you've got data, it enables you to prioritize what you're going to do for improvement. And then a time series plot. So this is just plotting, in this case, number of defects. You could plot the number of abandoned calls if it's a call center context, or the number of complaints, whatever you're measuring, against an appropriate time period. And again, this can be very helpful in measure at the beginning of a project, and then it's repeated after you've introduced your improvement measures, so that you can track the impact of your Lean Six Sigma activity. In Analyze, got a fishbone diagram here. or otherwise known as a cause and effect diagram. This is a way of identifying and organizing potential causes of a problem. So this would be generated typically as a group, so involving people close to the process and brainstorming, grouping together, working out what's going wrong and why those things might be going wrong. Often used in conjunction with other team-based problem-solving tools to prioritize which causes you're going to go after first. And then this one's a scatter plot. So this is to determine whether or not there's a relationship between two measures or indicators in this length. I wonder if there is a correlation between how long a call takes and how much experience the employee has. In actual fact, in my experience, that's not true. In actual fact, what I tended to find interesting is that the longer someone's been somewhere, the longer the calls, interestingly. But you're doing that to establish whether there is a relationship. And again, that's insightful to you because you're trying to work out what the causes might be in this case for maybe some call durations that are beyond your appetite or indeed outside of your customer's expectation. In Improve, tool I've chosen just to show you here is the Prioritization Matrix. So again, everything within a Lean Six Sigma project is done very consciously and deliberately. You're not leaving things to chance. So what you're doing in Improve, having worked through your possible causes and brainstormed possible solutions, is you would then prioritize those. So in the opinion of the group that generated those, which solutions are going to deliver you the biggest benefits soonest? Again, so that you're getting biggest bang for your buck, and working out how all of this is going to hang together. You know, one would need to then construct an implementation plan, contemplate how this is to be introduced as change to the business, and so on. So having it in a prioritization matrix like this and contemplating the sequence of events, what things are going to be delivered and when, can be really helpful. And then finally, in Control, I've chosen to show you a control chart. So what's going on here, a control chart is a tool used, and it's not always used, but it's sometimes used to determine the impact of a change. So what's going on here, you've got some defects and obviously significant variability, so sometimes it's a higher number, sometimes it's a lower number. The two yellow lines represent kind of the sort of the minimum acceptable and the highest acceptable, so the minimum and max that we saw on the normal distribution chart earlier on. Post your Lean Six Sigma activity, you've made some improvements, and you can see what's happened is that reduction has, that variability rather, has reduced, and so as a consequence, the minimum and maximum have as well. Those minimum and maximum average values have reduced as a consequence of your activity. So a control chart is used to make sure that your improvement measures have delivered the improvement that you expected them to. And you would monitor that very closely in the very early hours, days of the project, depending on the context, and make appropriate adjustments if that data was going the wrong way. I mentioned Lean Six Sigma certifications. Before that, let me make those recommendations I promised around books. So the first one, there is a very good book, and for those that do go on to do some certification, it's one of, well, both of them actually are in the recommended reading. The first one is called What is Lean Six Sigma? And that book was written by Mike George, Dave Rowlands and Bill Castle. What I'll do is, Janet, I'll provide this to you so that in the email that goes out, these details can be provided. That's an introduction to Lean Six Sigma and assumes no prior knowledge. There's another book called Lean Six Sigma Pocket Toolbook. I've shown you some of the tools. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And what the Lean Six Sigma Pocket Toolbook does is helpfully explain how each of those tools is used, what information it gives you, what information you need to be able to use it, and so on. So I would recommend those two as an introduction to the topic. In terms of certification, there is an International Association for Six Sigma Certification, the IASSC. That's the professional association dedicated to growing and enhancing the standards within the Lean Six Sigma community. And within IASSC, there are a series of certifications available for people if they are practitioners of Lean Six Sigma. The classifications they describe them as belts. So the ones I'm going to go through with you now are the yellow, green and black belts, and that might be terminology that you've heard of. So what do those coloured belts denote, and what will someone with that certification be able to do? A certified Lean Six Sigma yellow belt will be able to lead certain limited improvement projects. So perhaps working with a small team on one of the processes, a fairly tight, narrow scope. They'd be able to lead that unsupported. Or, most typically, to kind of gain their experience and in confidence, what would happen is that they would participate in some bigger projects, maybe ones that are being run with a certified green belt or a certified black belt. And the certification itself covers the foundational elements, so they would be able to talk about the methodology, they would know how to undertake the various stages of the project that we were just looking at. Moving on, the certified green belt qualification is an extension of the yellow belt. So this is where they're able to lead more complicated projects, maybe involving more people, more employees, perhaps a greater number of processes, more stakeholders, that kind of thing. And as well, they would be participating in some projects being managed and led by a certified black belt, again to develop and grow. And they would be conversant with some of the more advanced elements of the Lean Six Sigma methodology. So they would have a theoretical and a practical knowledge of a greater number of tools, which means that they can solve more problems. They have a greater number of tools that they can use to solve your business challenges. And then the final one is the black belt. So a certified Lean Six Sigma black belt. These will be able to lead complicated improvement projects, often as part of a bigger transformation, and they would have a thorough knowledge, theoretical and working knowledge of all elements of the Lean Six Sigma methodology. So we're going to wrap Lean Six Sigma back up now in the closing slide, because I just wanted to anchor Lean Six Sigma into kind of a bigger picture, because whilst we've spent the call talking about Lean Six Sigma, often what's going on is that is part of a much bigger transformation that the organisation is undertaking. So these are some of the other lenses or perspectives, elements to these broader projects. There might be a technology angle. It might be that you do much more in-depth work on customer. It might be that you need to look at how performance at a business level is managed, as well as an individual level. It might be that you look at skills and capability. Is your workforce equipped to do what is being asked of them to deliver to your client requirements? It might want to include a focus around behaviours within the organisation, and there might be a stream and a strand on data as well. So Lean Six Sigma it can be very useful on its own, definitely as a starting point for some continuous improvement activity. But as confidence grows, maybe as you acquire certification and that experience, often what happens is that they'll flesh out into much bigger programs of organisational change. some contact details, so that'll be in the deck that comes out to you. If you would like any more information on the subject, let me know.
Well, we're running a bit late, but we will go through a couple of quick ones, if you don't mind, Mark, and thank you all for staying.
On there.
Rick, who
and then we've got
actually go, has asked, can this be used for new startups or new setups for business?
Of course. Great question. Yes, it can. So my last two clients have been effectively startups, more mature startups, it's fair to say, so not within their first 6 months of work, but working with organisations that have been going for sort of between 5 and 10 years. It's a really interesting question. I think there is a benefit to looking at this stuff, but some of the discipline, particularly around data, can be quite a challenge for very young firms and startups to grapple with, because part of what makes them successful in those very early stages of a startup and entrepreneurship is...
I would imagine that a new startup is very innovative, and that's what makes them successful, and probably a little way down the line,
it's possible,
they
but
have
it
to do the
requires
measurements.
careful negotiation and handling.
I would imagine that a new startup is very innovative, and that makes them successful.
That's right.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
This is more of a statement, really, and a bit of
certainly
information.
Michael
has mentioned that OpenLearn also has a link to OU iTunes U, where there are lean case studies on Scottish Power, and I will find that for everyone and send that out as well. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions, so I will actually say good night and thank you very much, Mark. So that was really very, very interesting, so thank you.
Great.